Okay, yes, I know brief is in brackets in the title, so you think, oh, this absolutely deranged Limbus guy is gonna rant for 17 hours, but I promise, I'm here to actually be as brief as possible this time. You want a guide, so allow me to deliver. In this video, I'll be talking about the overall mechanics of Railway 3, then I'll talk about the fights themselves, tackling them in 3 segments, which I'll be calling Gossypium segment, ABM or Ardor Blossom Moth segment, and the Hell segment. Pretty self-explanatory there. A few disclaimers. If you have not played Canto 5 in its entirety, why are you here? You don't even have access to Railway 3, but just so you know, there will be spoilers for Canto 5 all throughout this video, so consider this your final and only warning. As well, I do not intend for this video to be a low turn count guide. Thankfully, sub 100 turns can absolutely come naturally just by nature of understanding the fights before you go into the railway, which is, you know, the whole point of the video. Last thing, if this video helps you, I would appreciate it if you subscribe, since I'm trying to get to 15,000 subscribers for the Limbus anniversary. Did I say 15,000? I meant 16,000. That's actually always been my goal, so that would be really cool. Thanks. With that, let's get into the mechanics. For those of you who played, or at least knew of Railway 2, you know that Railway 3 has far less gimmicks. Loops are gone, team and enemy buffs are gone, skill bag carryover is gone, and in its place we really only have 2 unique mechanics to Railway 3. First, and probably most impactful, the rest stops and the rewind mechanic. These will be pretty integral to having a good time getting through Railway 3. Rest stops will fully heal your entire team, and have them retain their SP if they are above 0, and SP is reset back to 0 if they are below. You can also swap out your entire team, including ego, IDs, and even support IDs as much as you want. I'll be talking about these quite a bit when discussing strategy, so keep them in mind. Rewinding is exactly how it sounds. You can just go back and redo any stage you want to. For doing an initial clear, this isn't really that relevant, except if you mess up and realize you brought the wrong team, you can go back to a rest point and rectify the mistake without having to start over. The second mechanic is one that I think a lot of people missed, myself included, and it's being able to continue after losing all 6 of your sinners in a battle. Health is tracked externally now in Railway, meaning that even if you lose, you have a good chance of making a comeback with the other half of your sinner roster. This, in combination with the rest stops fully healing your party, means that the last nodes of each segment become less scary, since basically without consequence, you can throw all 12 of your sinners at the fight like disposable ammunition, which is much more in line with the lore, so good job PM, I think this is a great addition. And that's genuinely it for new mechanics to the Railway itself. It feels weird considering this is such a huge part of what made Railway 2 so daunting, but Railway 3 takes a step back gimmicks-wise. But that's not to say the fights are going to go down easy just because they lack gimmicks. So let's talk about the first of the 3 Railway segments, the Gossypium segment. The Gossypium segment consists of Wail of the Porous Hand Mermaids, Silt Current, and Gossypium. Gossypium, I don't know and can't be bothered to know. What we do need to know is what to bring into this segment beforehand. Since it's such a big deal, let me just talk about the most relevant IDs for this railway on the whole, and I'll highlight the ones that are particularly good for the Gossypium segment while doing that. I won't do this for every segment, this is just to establish a baseline for good IDs in the context of this railway. WB Sang and Spicebush Sang are both good options for the Yi Sang slot, though if you have access to the Sunshower ego, Spicebush is going to serve you very well in this railway overall, and is likely better for this first third. And Faust is pretty good here, with Whistles and Whispers potentially providing some early sanity depending on your team composition, but Regret Faust and 7 Faust are also very valid options, and so is LobCorp Remnant Faust. Warp Dawn is the premier choice here for sure, to no one's surprise, as well as Warp Ryoshu. Merceau shouldn't really be run, but if he's your only choice for a healing ego, then running Rhino or Warp Merceau is correct. For Honglu, I think Diechi is 100% the correct play for this segment, especially for Gossypium. Ting Tang suffers due to pretty high lust resistances in this segment, but he can still get the job done in the railway overall, and we'll talk about the last option a bit later. Heathcliff should be on Rabbit or Harpooner. Ishmael has no bad options when it comes to her 3 stars, and, well, Captain Ishmael will be out by the time this video releases, so I'm sure she's really good for the railway. Rodian should be on Diechi for this entire railway. Sinclair for this segment should be on St. Clair, but Talisman Sinclair is another Sinclair to keep in mind, and Claire can also work, but St. Clair's high, consistent clashing is really valuable. Otis should be on Molar unless you are running a burn team, and if you don't have Molar, be sure to slot in BL Otis for the support passive. Every bit of extra damage helps. Then Gregor should be on Pirate. but he can also be used for support passives in order to have trickle healing on your team, which can be pretty relevant in this railway. Whew. Okay, so that was a lot of ranting for my advice to basically come down to bring Pierce, Slash, Wrath, and Pride. And weirdly, I think most importantly, Evade. Most of the IDs I recommend do have Evade, which is partially a coincidence, but it will also be relevant later. For those who need to use support IDs, I would say W Dawn or Diechi Honglu are the most important factors to have for this particular part of the railway, but really, anywhere you are missing a strong ID, be sure to fill it in with a support. There is actually no reason not to, since I know there are a lot of people willing to add friends, and I would offer too, but I can't anymore. So let's talk about this first fight of the railway, Whale of the Porous Hand Mermaids. Here's the best thing about this railway, at least for me. I know that you have already completed 519, since you need to have completed the Canto 5 dungeon to access this railway to begin with, so really, there's not much for me to say. This is your place to gain sanity, which is made slightly harder by the fact that the mermaids are lower level than you, meaning killing them will not give you or your team sanity. If any of your IDs are level 38 or below though, that will make them gain sanity on this fight, which, hilariously enough, since IDs can be leveled and uptied mid-railway, going into this fight with only level 38 IDs could be optimal. But I digress. Again, we aren't here to optimize, we're here to win. And ideally win without having to re-roll or reset for anything, because that's kind of lame. Nothing here should pose any real threat besides, I guess, these two attacks by the big mermaids, but even then, by the time they come out, you should have a decent enough amount of sanity to win, and they should be a cakewalk. Silt Current, on the other hand, is less of a cakewalk, but still relatively easy. This is a 2-wave boss fight, and starts off with 6 of the Whale of 1,000 Strand mermaids. These are level 40, which would mean you gain sanity from killing them, but due to their passive, the ID that kills them will only go SP neutral. However, allies will gain 5 SP per mermaid killed, so SP should be no problem past this point. Use this wave to make sure most, if not all of your IDs, are at 45 SP. One thing to note for all of these one wave of generic enemies then a boss fights is that setting up certain ego passives can be very strong. Specifically, Tepathos Mathos allows Otis to just deal 30% more damage so long as she doesn't take any damage, and can be very strong in this railway on the whole. Once you're past the mermaids, you have John Obsession himself, and there are a few ways to tackle this fight. The first way is the completely bog standard way. Just clash his attacks like normal, let him set up his little domain expansion, and play around the Paralyze as best you can, while making sure to destroy the Flotsam when they are unbroken so you don't have to deal with the Blind Obsession every turn, since it has to target a broken Flotsam if there is one on the field. Again, I'm sure you already know these because you did the Canto 5 dungeon, but it's to reiterate. That said, the tricky part of this fight really is all condensed into that second turn. In terms of options for clashing, that first and hopefully only Blind Obsession targeted at you are definitely somewhat limited. However, don't let the one Paralyze scare you. I think the safest option is to have W Dom with a Rip Space available going into turn 2 of the Silt Current fight, as in when you are actually fighting Silt Current. The one Paralyze means that, for the first clash, you can only roll to a max of 25, but it is still enough to beat out Blind Obsession's max roll of 23. As soon as the first clash is won, it should be easy enough. The only other problem could be the fact that your sanity will likely not be 45 due to crashing Silt Current, the move that sets up the altered environment, slightly lowering your SP due to the sinking. If you wish to be extremely safe, you can evade this move, since even though it is unclashable, you can still evade it, though this does mean that Rip Space cannot be in your bottom slot. There are a few other options for clashing this, like DDEDR, Quick Suppression with 6+ speed. In terms of ego, Pursuance, both versions, literally cannot lose if you are at level 40, and Sunshine Otis is the same deal. Plenty of other ego hover around the 20 to 22 base power range, which means you just need a little bit of good luck, and by that I mean just not getting the worst luck. I could go on listing potential counterplay, but this video is brief, I swear, I hope. So let's talk about the other way to try to kill this guy, and that's focusing down the Fluorescence. The Fluorescence body part is actually more vulnerable to damage than the body. The main reason it's not usually attacked very much is because the body does far more attacks, and taking damage is bad. However, if you're willing to bite the bullet, you can rush down the Fluorescence on turn 1. Breaking this part means that the rolls are reversed, and Mr. Fish over here will be the one eating 1 Paralyze every turn, and he gives you a nice, juicy broken part to target, meaning you will deal more damage. The only issue is what I mentioned before. You will likely take a lot of unopposed attacks, unless you get lucky with Evade and targeting. Evade works in a very simple way in focused encounters. If you evade on the leftmost slot of a body part, which would be no problem here since the only body part you'd be evading on is the body, if you successfully evade the first attack, you'll keep going down the line, as it were. As many times as there are attacks to evade, so long as you don't get hit and break your evade. This means if you want to nuke down the fluorescence and don't need every sinner to do so, you could potentially have one sinner evade all of the other attacks being done on the body. This is not the likely outcome, of course, unless you are St. Otis, but mitigating the damage a little bit is definitely useful, and evading only 2 of his, I think he does 4 attacks total, could be good. Regardless, once you have found your rhythm and the very first Blind Obsession was clashed with, and the Flotsam was broken, or the Fluorescence was broken on turn 1, then the fight should be pretty easy from there. Just clash his attacks, deal as much damage as possible. He doesn't have that much health, he should go down quick. Now, Gossypium, the abnormality of this segment's namesake. Gossypium is a fight that intends to drain you in the long term, and hard punishes you if you mess up and don't play into its gimmick. In terms of the team you want to have here, having 6 IDs with Evade will make it so you can get through this fight almost guaranteed. If those IDs also have Slash, then even better. This is one of those fights I have heard people struggle on the most, and it really does come down to not realizing that Evade exists, and also you need to not get too unlucky. Though it is worth noting that this is the very last fight of the segment, so losing and going back in with your other team is a very viable option. So what's tricky about Drenched Gossypium? Well, the Gossypium debuff is unavoidable from this attack here, and the red-stained Gossypium state will happen after a few turns. My best recommendation is to try and spread the Gossypiums across Sinners, as to not stack bleed too high on one of them once the red-stained Gossypium phase comes through, which will make it so you take bleed based on the amount of Gossypium. Drenched Gossypium will also gain clash power based on the number of Gossypium on that ID, so be a little wary. I think the main thing people struggle with is this attack, Draining Roots and Flourishing/Scattering Gossypium. Draining Roots is easy to deal with the minute you remember Evade exists, and I've already pushed that envelope so hard I could get hired as a professional mailman, so I think you understand all there is to be said there. Except, one more thing. You already know that unclashable doesn't mean unevadable, but it can also be redirected still. And since Gossypium has only one body part, whenever you evade Draining Roots, which, by the way, doesn't have to be every turn, you can maybe dodge another attack alongside it if you're feeling lucky. Flourishing/Scattering Gossypium are just decently high-rolling attacks, but you can make them slightly less scary by clashing with a Sinner that does not have the most bleed, and winning these clashes is pretty paramount. But once you have that idea ingrained into your head of occasional evades, and literally just paying attention to the scary attacks, Gossypium shouldn't be too bad. For this fight in particular, try to avoid IDs that rely too heavily on lust skills to deal damage, since, and quite a few abnormalities have this now, the 0.2 times resistance is pretty brutal. So Molar Otis, Ting Tang Hongaloo, and Endfaust all have their damage pretty nerfed by this fight. St. Clair technically should also count, but his clashing is so good it hardly matters, and having good clashing is a pretty big upside. One last thing to note, the check on this fight is one you are meant to be below the threshold shown on, and lust skills will be easier to lose with. Basically, just choose the ID that says high or very high when possible. It's the same idea, but you need to be below. Once you're past Gossypium, we enter the ABM segment. This is where you want your team to have as many good Gloom and Sloth IDs as possible, so Diechirodion is a no-brainer, especially if you have access to Rhymeshank, but what is also important is to have any very high rolling ego. Whether you have that innately or have to use a support ID for it, it's pretty worth it. Ardor Blossom Star, Blind Obsession, Sun Shower, specifically the Threadspin 4 versions of those 2 ego, and any other 33 plus rolling ego, you are going to want at least one of, and to have that Sinner be at 45 SP before the end of the segment. Thankfully, Clam helps a lot with that, working as the introductory fight to segment 2, and he's a joke. The entire game plan of the Clam fight is to just destroy the green slime he is targeting, destroy all of them if you don't want the poison on you, or if you want the sanity, then win the check on turn 3, which will hurt you and lower your SP, bear in mind, but it will also lower his green slime amount to 0, hopefully, leaving the Pearl vulnerable. Speaking of, the Pearl is the part you should be dealing your damage to when possible, but you likely won't have any great opportunities before the turn 3 happens, unless you use AoE ego to destroy the green slimes, which is a perfectly viable strategy. Once the Pearl is open to you, the fight should be over within 2 turns. There really isn't much more to say. Don't waste too many resources here, especially your Gloom resources, since you are going to want them for the next upcoming fights. The only scary attack Clam has is Effervescent Green Slime, but again, the fight should be on its way out by the time you see this attack start to really happen. And otherwise, yeah, use a few ego on it and it'll all be fine. Ambling Pearl will dance his way to an early grave. Skin Profit marks the halfway point, and definitely a kind of turning point for this railway as a whole. Now, that's not to say this fight is particularly hard, but it can definitely be somewhat of a pain. By the way, these next two fights is where Dietchi Honglu really shines, so if he's not already at a decent amount of sanity, be sure to bring him into the clam fight to get his SP on the rise. Skin Profit will start out with 5 candles, different from his Kanto version, which only had 4. In order to deal any real damage to him, all 5 candles must be lit. The issue here is that when you only have some of the candles lit, the lit ones will use a Wrath skill. This means if you have 4 of the 5 candles lit, there will be quite a lot of attacks happening. They aren't very scary, but still. And not to mention, Mr. Twitlonger over here will constantly do unclashable attacks and has a pretty nasty counter. There are a few ways to deal with this unlit candles phase. You can just do it completely normally and go around lighting the candles best you can. I would recommend partially damaging all of them in one turn, then lighting them all the next, but you can just use a single 5 attack weight ego to light them all in turn 1 and evade the unclashables or deal damage to Skin Profit instead. It's up to you. However, you may have tried that and you might be thinking, man, when I use my ego on Skin Profit, I only hit 3 of the candles maximum. How did Esku get to be so cool and hit all 5 candles with 1 attack? Well, I got to be so cool through rampant nepotism and exploitation of the capitalist systems of America, but attack weight manipulation is something even the lower class can do. Attack weight manipulation is a very simple trick that uses the fact that skills with attack weight will prioritize untargeted slots. So in order to make it so we hit the candles only, we just throw all of our skills onto Skin Profit's skill slots instead. This can all be actual attacks, or all defensive skills to evade those unopposed attacks. In the example on screen, Ebony Stem will also end up hitting Skin Profit due to the 7 attack weight of the Threadspin 4 version, but the 5 attack weight version will work just as well. Ebony Stem and Fluid Sac are the best ego for this, and you need 5 attack weight to properly pull this off, but 3 attack weight can be used, and the other candles can be cleaned up by regular attacks. This just feels way cleaner and is way cooler. Ebony and Fluid Sac are best because they align with the sin weaknesses of the candles, meaning even a Tails roll on Ebony Stem is enough to perfectly light all the candles that are hit. By the way, you must keep your attack on Skin Profit for this to work. If you remove all the skills after doing this, the ego will still show as hitting the candles, but will behave as normal. After candles are lit, this just becomes another session of beating up the world's strongest Twitter user, as in they are weak to being cut with a very, very sharp and gloomy knife. The cycle will repeat every couple of turns, but this should be done after 2 cycles maximum, and even if it isn't, the scariest move he has is the 9-2 move, but plenty of ego have a 20 base floor, including Otis's base ego, so it is almost completely for free. In fact, if you lose to this, you have to, try. Now, the second hardest fight in Railway, at least when you're playing blind. First of all, remember that high-rolling ego I told you to have? I mean, you do have it, right? Well, this is the fight where it's actually needed, and you should, hopefully, have plenty of resources to use it at least twice. The first few turns of this fight are nothing special. Focusing down the wings is the correct play, since they are weaker to Slash, Gloom, and Sloth, and also have a much lower health. So once they break, you have a little while to deal 2 times damage with all the damage types, and yes, the wings do regenerate after some time, so deal your damage while you can. The real, and frankly, only issue of this fight, outside of the burn chip damage, is Ardor Blossom Star. The skill, not the ego. On paper, this isn't that scary. Until you start reading, then it's really scary. Ardor Blossom Moth does something very unique. It transforms its attacks into Wrath skills, meaning this line of text, where this skill gains clash power equal to Wrath affinity skills that Ardor Blossom Moth would use this turn times 2, is generally plus 12 clash power, and you just eat some burn 2 for fun. So hopefully you have some kind of sustain ego or a Gregor ID that heals you on the bench. This entire fight revolves around clashing and winning against Ardor Blossom Star. You lose the clash, 5/6 of your team is crippled or dead. That's not an exaggeration. This is where your high rolling ego come in, but also Rip Space, DDER, and Mutilate can help you out here, though it's not completely consistent, alongside some Stray Paralyze if you can scrounge it up from somewhere. Ardor Blossom Star clashes pretty well against Ardor Blossom Star, but even if Ardor Blossom Star wins, it won't deal much damage due to Ardor Blossom Moth's resistances, and if you drop a coin even once using Ardor Blossom Star will kill your whole team. Okay, yeah, that was worded to be confusing on purpose. The point is, if you get unlucky with any ego and hit a 5% chance, yeah, you can just lose. But the good thing is this fight is the last one before a rest stop once again, so you may choose to continue. However, I would only recommend doing this if Ardor Blossom Moth is at or below 300 HP, since the 6 sinners you bring in are likely to be low sanity and or support passive fodder, depending on how you build your team. Don't be afraid to spend some of your resources here, since this can be one of your bigger reset points in the railway if you don't take your chance to kill it once you get it. The worst part is that this fight is never over until it is over, since one silly usage of Ardor Blossom Star and one incredibly infuriating and also silly hitting of a 5% chance can mean you're headed back to this screen. Again, Diechi Honglu and Diechi Rodian are really prime IDs to have here, but Warp Ryoshu is another particular standout, since anything Slash weak, melts when she is a factor. And this is also my daily time to remind you that Force with Flames is a base ego that allows you to deal plus 20% more damage the next turn and rolls a 28. So I would highly recommend using that to speed up your fights, since even if this isn't about optimization, going faster means you have a smaller chance to die. Now that you're past the hard stuff, let's get into the hard stuff. The Hell segment, which, well, it's a dramatic name, but I mostly only call it that out of obligation. But this segment alone seems to have tripped up a lot of people, and it's not hard to see where the problem lies. So let's address that problem with our team setup. If you were using Rabbit Heathcliff, it's time to toss that coked up British bunny bumpkin to the side and bring out your Harpooner Heathcliff, very specifically with Body Sack equipped. Alternatively, K-Corpong Lu, and then alternatively, N-Corp Merzo. These are your Ahab eaters, but let's reverse that, so these are your EAs. We will be coming back to them in a bit, but for everything else on your team, it's full speed towards pierce damage. But W Ryoshu can stay because while damage type up matchups do matter, once the enemy is staggered, only Sin Affinities matter, and Envy/Pride are pretty favored here, especially for Gas Harpoon. Firstly though, really quickly, we have Mermaids, but again, really this is one of the easier fights in Railway, and I don't want to waste too much time on it, but it serves as a good breather before Pequod Trio. So if your tank ID does not have full sanity, bring them in here to get them up to 45 is a smart play. The only tricky thing about this fight, besides the 3 waves and decently high rolling negative coins, is the second wave. These guys will lower your sanity by quite a lot if they all survive to the second turn, so I would recommend focusing down 1 or 2 of them and making sure they are dead, so the sanity deficit you take is lessened. Save your resources, be sure to have as many as possible to guarantee your success in the Pequod Trio, and now let's talk about them. So the strategy of this fight will be pretty different depending on who your planned tank is, but I really would recommend any of the 3 I mentioned before. For those who are somehow unaware or have forgotten how the trio works, Ahab will apply Prey Mark to one of your allies on turn 3, and then unleash unopposed attacks upon them. This is the main difficulty point of the fight, since this can quickly lead to an ally death, which can lead to sanity loss, and subsequently losing. Also having 1 less skill slot basically means you lost. The whole point of the 3 tanks and their respective strategies is to counteract this Prey Mark phase. Let me start with my favorite strategy for this fight, and that's using Harpooner Heathcliff as our core tank. The very first thing we want to do is to have Harpooner Heathcliff get staggered during the Pequod Town portion of the trio fight. This fight, having 2 waves, is actually really good for us, since we have time to set up ego passives and can stagger our Harpooner Heathcliff mid-battle. Staggering him then means he will have no more stagger bar for the rest of the fight, even if we heal him to full again. Pequod Town would be defeated as normal, and there's really no particular strategy I can give for those guys besides pierce attacks and remember how negative coin clashing works. You may be dominating against this skill, but on the last coin it can only roll a 13 or a 15, so be prepared for that. Now we are at the trio, and for every variation of this fight, I think bursting down Starbuck is the correct play on turns 1 and 2. This is pretty standard, and isn't too hard, since his stagger threshold is pretty high up, and he only has 500 health total. While bursting is important, it is also important that your Harpooner Heathcliff, or whatever tank you're using, is staying on as high health as possible. And what's even more important is making sure the Prey Mark is applied to your tank, in this case, Harpooner Heathcliff. Watch for Ahab doing a guard and this gluttony skill, and have Heathcliff be the one clashing or countering against that skill. The turn following track them to the end is when your Heathcliff will be eating 3 attacks from Ahab. However, it's hardly a concern, since we resist Pierce and Envy due to Body Sack. During this phase, you have no choice but to focus your damage into Queequeg, hopefully playing around her very strong counter with another Pierce resistant ID, and even if you don't play around it, 1 ID being staggered is not the end of the world. Heathcliff should pretty comfortably survive the first barrage of Ahab's attacks, and if Queequeg's shield has been properly depleted, which it should pretty easily, then you should have a bit of a break. From here, all damage should be headed Ahab's way. Be wary, since she can just heal to full once she's staggered, which is probably the most annoying thing about this fight in my opinion, but once that happens, just kill her again. The good thing is, even if you mess up to some extent, if you have even a single healing ego, or Sunshower Yisang for its 3 protection, Harpoon or Heathcliff can tank another round of Ahab's attacks, no problem. From this point onwards, if you do have that sustain ego, this can just become a slog until you kill Ahab. Don't bother trying to get through Queequeg's 1500 HP, since Ahab is far more vulnerable and will end the fight instantly once she dies. However, here's what makes Harpoon or Heathcliff the best option of the 3 I mentioned. He can actually deal very good damage to Ahab in return, and tanking more attacks actually just makes him stronger, and you are forced into tanking attacks, so your nuke turns are likely to be more potent when using the Harpoon or Heathcliff strategy. Now, let me talk about the 2 alternatives. Keikor Ponglu is probably the most common solution I see online, and I don't disagree that he can work. The strategy is about the same as with Heathcliff, but pre-staggering is kind of off the table, so the most important thing is to try and manipulate your health so you won't outright die to Ahab's attacks, and will instead activate your passive, making it so you can tank pretty comfortably from there. But Keikor Ponglu's damage is pretty bad for this fight. He can just sit there and eat attacks, but it's also the only thing he can do. By the way, for extra safety, I would recommend using Effervescent Corrosion on him to change his sin resistances to be more favorable against Ahab, removing the Envy Fatality. Then Ensult, who I think is probably the weakest option, but he can still work. He lacks damage like Keikor Ponglu, and he clashes even worse, but he does have a neat way to play around Ahab's onslaught, and that is with Chains of Others. Obviously, debuffing Ahab is a good idea, but the main draw is actually the protection gained for hitting heads with his ego, and the protection from the passive combined with his counter the next turn. Which, fun fact, this counter will do nothing besides provide the protection, since even counters don't work against Ahab. However, this means that during the Prey Mark phase, Merceau would be taking 60% less damage from the attacks, which is a really impressive damage reduction and more than counteracts Prey Mark. But if Ensult does get staggered, he will still likely die. And he doesn't have the passive to fall back on like Keikor Ponglu does, all while lacking good damaging options. What's worse, if you don't have an Ensult that's leveled up to bring in, then using your 1 support slot to grab him is probably one of the worst ideas you could have. Since K-Corp and Harpooner, I think, are far more consistent and better options, but I figure this is a strategy that warranted being mentioned. I'm sure there are plenty of other ways to get past this fight, but using any of these 3 tanks, bursting Starbuck, then bursting down Ahab when you can, is what I consider the best strategy for this fight. If you find that using one of these tanks doesn't work out for you, remember that you can always go back to the rest stop and try the other strategy. Once again, use support IDs to your utmost advantage. And hey, using multiple tanks is also a viable strategy, so long as you make sure to swap Prey Mark onto the other one once one gets low. And with all that said, you should make it through Pequod Trio with only a little bit of stress. After the Pequod Trio, well, I would like to say you're home free, but apparently people struggled to gas Harpoon, despite it being very, very similar to the Canto 5 version, which you have beaten before. Regardless, stay focused during this fight. I know it's hard when Compass is playing in the background and it's a banger, but this is basically the finish line. I'll briefly go over Gas Harpoon's phases. The Pip phase is the easiest by a good margin. There's no real gimmick here besides SP gain, so just clash the mass attack with any ego and make her evade fail. There should be next to no difficulties here, and oh, by the way, Harpooner Heathcliff is once again really good for this fight. So that's another reason to bring him along in this segment, and to use him on Pequod Trio, since if he is on low-ish health, he will tear through Ahab's phases due to her Pierce and Envy weaknesses. Starbuck's phase is next, and requires you to allow Prey Mark on at least 2 of your allies to then clash against this skill, or else you will need to slog through a pretty insufferable amount of protection. Giving the Prey Mark to Ryoshu is a good option, since Force for the Flames will win against this skill for free and give you Fragile next turn, and Otis works just as well, since 2 Pathos Mathos literally cannot lose. But really, any Ego Steal can work, and even most regular, high-rolling skills are a safe bet, like St. Clair's skill 2 and 3. Then the actually somewhat difficult phase. If you have a usage of Sun Shower, I would highly recommend using it just before, or just as, this phase begins. The 3 protection can be a lifesaver, or a stagger saver, I guess. Alternatively, if you just make sure your team is topped up on health before entering the Queequeg phase via Fluid Sac or any other means of healing, then this should go down pretty easily. since the counter doesn't do that much damage. Feel free to use evades or defensive skills to avoid eating counters on IDs that would stagger or die due to it, but there is a bit of a sense of urgency, due to the shield on Ahab lowering Sandy on hit and being pretty tough to get through. If you can get through your first turn of this phase without too much being lost, the fight becomes vastly easier since you will have to take less counters as the fight goes on. Sacrificing your IDs is an option here, so dying is once again okay if you feel confident you can close out the fight with what you have on the bench. Just spend your resources on the one actually hard phase, and you should be leaving behind the hurt of the gas harpoon fight in record time. And now, Spiral of Contempt. Now, look, I would usually recommend you just go and fight the Terminus boss for yourself before looking at a guide. That's how I felt about MFE, and it's how I felt about Sign of Roses, but that's not the case here. Spiral of Contempt is not a hard fight, but it is long and tedious and not very fun if you don't know what to do. So let me explain a few things that the game does not normally. You're probably looking at those resistances on screen and thinking, wow, what the fuck? And you're not wrong. However, this passive incentivizes running status teams, giving you fragilities for the most common sin affinities of those IDs. Burn, Bleed, Tremor, and Sinking can all work here, and the rest stop right before this fight means you could make your team composition into any of these statuses that you can build and find decent success during this fight. Now, I didn't mention Rupture because, well, saying Rupture only works on this fight is incorrect, since it utterly destroys it. Using Talisman Sinclair at uptime 4 and applying Talismans to the body on turn 2 means you can delete Spiral's health. Charge is probably the worst status to fully build around, since it requires you to use your nuke skills to apply fragility, which just doesn't happen often enough. But charge skills are good for nukes, so it's not that big of a downside. So that's a good way to deal more damage, but what about the fight itself? Well, it's also pretty simple. The only mechanics you truly need to worry about are Gaze, Contempt, and Grasp. Gaze and Contempt work in tandem. Having 7 Gaze will make you Contempt, which basically just nerfs your damage by 30%. Gaze is gained for every hit you do against the hand's body part. This is incredibly easy to play around. Just spread Gaze across your sinners as best you can, or just always use Ego to clash against the hands, since those are always single coin skills. Gaze is reset every few turns by this mass attack, so just be mindful of going above 6 Gaze. Now, Grasp is actually weird. This is incredibly easy to play around, you just avoid getting hit by this pride attack, and I guarantee you, most people who do this fight don't ever have that happen to them. Except that being grasped can be a good thing. Once an ID is grasped, they will no longer be under your control, similar to the Spicebush Dongbeck fight. Killing the ID after that, which isn't too hard, will lead to an abnormality check. This will allow you to choose from the 3 damage types, and if you succeed the following check, Spiral becomes weak to that damage type. Then you can choose a Sin Affinity, which you will also become weak to if you succeed that abnormality check. You can determine if this is worth it or not on your own. There's not a right or wrong answer, but I would recommend it, simply to cut down on the length of this fight, and it becomes especially short if you have lots of one damage type and Sin Affinity, so build your team accordingly. Because of this unique mechanic, there's not really a one-size-fit-all team, which is certainly neat. But after you know how to play around Contempt and potentially know how to make him even weaker, Spiral just comes down to winning clashes and dealing damage. He does start a timer of sorts on you once his body falls to below 30% HP, but honestly, I hardly even noticed this bit of HP and SP drain, and this is the end of the railway. So all resources at your disposal should be used at your discretion, and your discretion should be, fuck it, we ball. Either way, by the time he starts to slowly drain you, the fight is basically game, set, match. And so is Refraction Railway 3. You may have noticed that, unlike my Railway 2 guide, I did not bog this video down with my thoughts on each fight, and that's because, well, I didn't want to bog this video down. Railway 3 makes up for having far less fights than Railway 2 by having them be generally far more engaging on the whole, and I appreciate that, but it also means that I want to be as clear as possible when giving a guide for Railway 3. Well, as clear as I can be while still meeting the ESCU humor quota and being only 5 days out from Railway's release upon writing this script. So, if I missed anything or got something wrong, I trust the comments will be able to help me out there. I'll talk more about my thoughts on this railway when the inevitable Railway 3 with the worst team possible run happens, but for now, that's all from me. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something. This video